background. When I talk, so I study marine population connectivity, and what that means is how individual larvae travel between the islands. So geographically separate islands, or even populations on the same island, but they are separated by some sort of geography. And connectivity is important to understand when we design marine reserves and we try to preserve certain fish or certain ecosystems. Because it's important to know if you want to save a population, let's say the Hanauma Bay yellow tang, for instance. You want to know if all the adults were born here in Hanauma Bay or if they were born maybe on a different island. So whether they produce all their larvae themselves or if larvae are imported. Or maybe they send out all the little babies that they make. So knowing how these larvae or baby fish get around the islands is really important for management efforts, and that's what I'm interested in studying. So a lot of marine animals, almost all of them, have a biphasic life history strategy. And what that means is they have two different parts to their life. After they hatch as eggs, they have a larval stage where they are out in the open ocean, and that's when they do a lot of the moving around. And then when they grow into sort of adolescents and teenagers, they settle back on the reef. And even though a lot of these are fish and something that we consider very mobile and able to get around, they tend to favor a reef that they find. They tend to stay in a fairly small geographic area. And as an example, here we have a yellow tang. This is the adult version. And this is sort of what a larvae looks like. So they can look very different. They're often very see-through. When these are out in the open ocean, the white part here is completely clear, and all you can see is a silver streak down them. So they're very different, and they have very different needs than the adults do as well. So the dispersal of these larvae, a lot of them have some sort of behavior. They can swim, as you can sort of see on this photo here. They do have a tail, and they can sort of get around. But they're also at the mercy of ocean currents and where those ocean currents take them. And the sort of average flow around the Hawaiian Islands, which I'm going to show you in a minute, moves them around to some extent. But every now and then we have these sort of extreme events that come through, like hurricanes and things like that. But we also, and those are the ones that can have a disproportionate effect on the connectivity of these larvae between islands. Because a big storm is able to move larvae a lot more, or maybe a lot further, than just sort of your average currents can. So I'm interested in these extreme events and what they do to connectivity. So I decided to look at El Nino events. And here we have the Hawaiian Islands, the main Hawaiian Islands, and then I've been studying all the way up here to the northwestern. And this is just a schematic on the ocean current. So we have the majority of the flow here goes along the main Hawaiian Islands up towards the northwest, both on the north and south side of the islands. But we do have this Hawaii Lee countercurrent that moves water from west to east. So this has the potential of moving some of these larvae back towards the main islands here. But then if we look at El Nino, this is a photo I just took of this year's El Nino. I downloaded it a couple of days ago. And this is for temperature, but a lot of the currents that I look at are sort of temperature and pressure driven. And we have Hawaii up here in the square. And we can see that during El Nino, it's warmer usually around the equator. These are anomalies, temperature anomalies, so warmer or colder than normal. Red would be warmer than normal temperatures, and blues are colder than normal. So we can see here around the equator to the east side of the Pacific that we have warmer than normal temperatures, and over in the west side of the Pacific it's a little cooler than normal. But if we look at the Hawaiian archipelago here, we can see that some areas are warmer than normal, other areas, especially up here in the northwest, are cooler than normal. So we are sort of a little bit outside of the main influence of El Nino. So we are interested in how El Nino affects the currents in Hawaii, and we don't really know. We know we get wetter winters, we get more rain. We know we get a lot more storms, as was evidenced by the summer when we had hurricane after hurricane. But we don't really know how this changes the circulation. We also know that in some areas of the archipelago, during these El Nino events, we see higher, warmer temperatures, and in others, we see cooler ones. We can see that the waters, what we call stratified, become more layered, and they tend to do that when it's warmer. And that makes the water more stable, and the currents generally slower, or not able to move the water as much. But there's not a whole lot of information of how the circulation around Hawaii changes during El Nino events. So my question was, how does the connectivity pattern, how do these animal patterns change during El Nino? So for this, I created a computer model that uses ocean currents, and I ran it for the 1997-98 El Nino, which was one of the strongest on record, and then I ran it with the past sort of 3 years as a comparison, which I would call normal state years, or when there was no El Nino or La Nina present. And when I study connectivity, there's 3 things that I look for. So here we have the islands. We have a little larval tang down here. And when these are born and they sort of go out in the water and move around, if they come back to the island or the reef where they were born, I'm going to call that self-recruitment. And if they go out and then end up settling at a different reef, I call that dispersal or successful settlement. But then a whole lot of them just kind of get swept out to sea and they don't really make it. So we call that a loss of these animals. So looking at total settlement, just keep in mind that the light bars are the El Nino events, so the 97, 98 data, and then the dark bars are the normal state, or the sort of recent 3 years. And we can see here, we had the islands down on the x-axis, and then just sort of the proportion of the larvae that were released that successfully settled. But what you should keep in mind with this graph is all the dark bars are generally taller than the light bars. And that means that the total settlement is much higher during normal state years than they are during El Nino. So when these El Nino event happens, less larvae tend to settle, more get lost. And this is especially obvious here in the north, or in the main Hawaiian Islands. Excuse me. And then for self-recruitment, so how many come back to the same island where they were born, we can see here as well that the dark bars, again El Nino, and the light ones, the light ones are El Nino and the dark ones are the normal. We can see here again that during normal state years, we have higher self-recruitment. And that might not be a surprise, since we have higher total settlement. We have more of them that also come back and settle where they came from. And then we're also interested in, because these extreme events can transport larvae much further, potentially, than sort of the average ocean circulation state, the normal state. I was also interested in looking at how the distances these larvae travel before they can settle. So looking at that, for this one, we see that the distance from where they were born, or the distance from the source, is longer during El Nino generally. The light bars are taller than the dark bars here. But there's only a few of them that are statistically significant. But it's a trend that these larvae tend to travel much further to successfully settle during El Nino than they do during normal state years. So all in all, to summarize this, during El Nino, we have smaller or less settlement. We have higher settlement during normal state years. For the self-recruitment, it's also lower during El Nino, higher during normal state years. And the distance that they travel is further during El Nino, and shorter distances during normal state years. So this means that far fewer larvae settle during these events. So if we have a population that has a hard time maybe staying alive, or that has a lot of fishing pressure on it, they can be extra vulnerable during these El Nino events. And with with climate change, researchers are expecting more and more frequent events. So that's something to maybe keep in mind when we design reserves for the future. We also know that a lot of these populations have a harder time with self-recruitment during El Nino. So they're more dependent on influx of larvae from other islands and other sites. They're not as able to self-sustain or produce enough young to keep the population the same size. But more distant populations do get connected during an El Nino. And this is really interesting because this opens up an avenue for increased genetic material to be exchanged between these populations. And this might build a more diverse fish population that might be more resilient towards other climate change factors such as temperature or changing food and things like that. So the next step in my research is to try to figure out what it is that drives these changes. We don't know a lot about the currents, or if it's the currents that drive these changes that we see in settlement. So I'm going to see if I can tease out whether it's the change in currents or if it's the change in temperature, maybe the larvae's food availability, because they eat when they're out in the open ocean as well. So those are my next steps. So with that, I would like to thank my committee, Sea Grant, and some other folks who have helped me out. And I will take questions after the third talk. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for coming today. My name is Jessie, and I'll be talking about the economics of oyster farming here in Hawaii. So I always like to start my talks off by introducing people to the idea of aquaculture. So aquaculture is basically the aquatic version of agriculture. So some of the things we're farming currently are different species of fish like Hawaiian kampachi, Chinese catfish, and recently the island of Hawaii has also started farming Pacific white shrimp. And we also farm things like limu, which are edible seaweeds. But for a long time, something has been missing from this picture. So what do you notice is missing here that's often farmed elsewhere, especially on the mainland United States? The answer is bivalve shellfish, like clams and oysters. So why do we even care? Does it really matter if we're missing this component of aquaculture? The State of Hawaii Animal Industry Division puts it best, and they say by producing locally grown seafood, we can generate more revenues, create more skilled, high-wage jobs, reduce our reliance on imported seafood, and have better control over product quality. And also, aquaculture is in line with the state's food self-sufficiency initiative, and more farming would help us build our regional food system here in Hawaii. So here's a little background on both oyster farming here and traditional fish pond aquaculture. So starting with the fish ponds, at the bottom left, you see what's called a loco guapa, which is one type of fish pond that we have here in the islands. So this one is a shoreline adjacent pond. And at the bottom right corner of that picture, you see something called a sluice grate that allows the control of coastal water in and out, and also keeps large predators out, and lets your juvenile fish be raised in relative safety. So these are the kind of ponds we're thinking of using for oyster farming for the same reasons, to keep the predators out. And traditionally, these ponds were used to farm things like the fish you see up there, which is called moi, or Pacific redfin. But ever since the island saw a shift from subsistence farming and aquaculture to cash crop farming, a lot of these fish ponds have fallen into disrepair. So the upper right corner, you see an example of one of those seawalls that's fallen apart. And unfortunately, because a lot of these species like moi are not economically viable, there's been very little incentive to restore the fish ponds and use them for aquaculture. So the last time oysters were farmed here, they were done using a land-based system. In the bottom right corner, you see a picture of what we call raceways. So essentially, they're just enclosures where you run water through, and that delivers nutrients to the oysters. And they require moving water because they're filter feeders, so they need that constant influx of algae to feed on. And the moving water also delivers waste away. But the problem with that is it's extremely cost intensive because it requires a lot of electricity as well as water, and you have to build the entire facility to do this type of farming. So oyster farming now is pretty different. We're using these Hawaiian fish ponds, like I mentioned. It's called a loco guapa. And so this method utilizes these mesh cages you see there on the left-hand side. So the farmers will stock the oysters in the cages and then throw them out over the water. So by floating them, it keeps them off the the benthic substrate where they might get eaten by crabs and other predators. And it also allows the oysters to be rolled. And this rolling process actually allows them to develop a nice round sort of shell so they can have a fuller cup. And they also get sorted several times a week. So by the time they reach about 3 or 4 inches, they're ready for market. But before they do that, they actually have to go through this process called depuration. So in the lower right-hand corner, you see some oysters being depurated. It's basically just a 48-hour saltwater bath. Because oysters are culture feeders, they can actually sequester contaminants from the water. So if you have rain and there's runoff from your watershed, they can actually filter feed those and sequester them. So if we eat them, we have also the potential to eat those contaminants. So this step in the farming process ensures that they're safe to eat. And up in the right corner, you see some oysters on the half shell ready to be eaten. So what are the problems we're facing right now? Why has this industry been missing so long? Again, like I mentioned, it was because of that shift to cash crop farming. And so the fish ponds have been in disrepair. And for a long time, the state actually lacked technicians to certify these growing areas. But things have changed, and people are getting excited about the prospect of farming oysters again. But one of the problems we're facing is there's no economic assessment for this type of aquaculture right now. We have no idea if it's profitable and if it's competitive with imported oysters, which are the only oysters that have been available for at least 17 years. Any literature on both the methods and the economics of oyster farming here are completely outdated and date back to the 1980s. And because of that, all the stakeholders involved lack information. So they have very little data on the biology of farming them here, how quickly they grow, and whether or not it's going to be viable economically. So my project aims to solve these problems. So where we have no economic assessment, my first objective is to conduct both a production and a market assessment. So by production, I mean, what are the costs, and is it something that's worth undertaking in light of these costs? And on the market side, we want to find out if people are even interested in something grown here locally when they've been eating imported oysters for years. As for the outdated literature, that's simple enough. I'm going to do the research, aim to publish, and hopefully I can update the literature. And where stakeholders lack information, I want to take the research I do and disseminate it and make it publicly available. So this is just a flowchart of my project. So I begin with the economic assessment, and there's 2 parts, one being the production side, the other being the marketing side. So for the production side, I'm just creating a simple budget, and with those numbers, I can conduct different types of analyses that you see in that blue box there. For the marketing side, I'm going to be surveying both wholesalers on the island, as well as different restaurants that survey the oysters. By serving the wholesalers, I'm trying to discover what they're interested in buying, what attributes of oysters have satisfied their needs for the last 17 years. Is it size? Is it color? Is it species? Maybe it's even the place where they're grown out. And when I acquire that information, I'll be surveying the restaurants. And by surveying the restaurants, we figure out what customers are also looking for in terms of oyster attributes. And when I get all this information, I'm hoping to publish and again disseminate that information. So what do you do with all these numbers? So I go out there and I collect the costs from the only operating farm, but that doesn't tell you how well they're doing. So I'm going to be conducting a series of economic analyses. The first one being a simple budget breakdown. So what percentage of their total costs is labor? How much of it is utilities, materials, permits? And can you cut down on these costs? And even if you do they make a difference? So here's an example of the kind of table I'll be creating. You take any 2 inputs into your budget, so it can be any of your costs. Maybe it's your electric bill, maybe it's the cost of your labor, or maybe it's other inputs like the mortality rate you're seeing, because you always have die-off when you're farming live species. And so in this case, I take mortality rate and the market price, and you can quickly cross-reference them to see what your estimated annual profit will be. Here's another example. So no need to understand what MIRR is. It's just a way to measure your profit. But what a sensitivity table does is it tells you which of your inputs are going to have the most impact on your profit. So the ones with the steeper slope, in this case the blue and orange lines representing market price and mortality rate, are the most sensitive. What this table tells you is that if you're starting here at a 0% change, so these are your baseline values, so this is how much you're currently paying for water, how much you're currently paying for labor, you can see how a slight increase, let's say if you're currently selling oysters for $1.25, you raise that price 10%, this is how much higher your profit's going to go. So you can see here, you could maybe decrease your mortality rate, find ways to have achieved higher survival, but that's not really going to affect, that is going to affect your profit at a much quicker pace than, say, if you're trying to find ways to reduce your rent costs. Okay, and here's another example of the type of economic analysis I do. The word stochastic just means you've got variables involved, so it's somewhat unpredictable. You might have maybe a $10,000 profit one year, you might be in the negative next year. So what I do is I take this cost input and I generate a range of worst case to best case scenarios to tell you a range of outcomes for any given year. So in this case, if you're following the red line and you go over here, you see that you have about a 60% chance of making a negative profit. So this kind of tells you how well you're doing and what your chances of actually making a profit are. So that was for the production side. For the marketability side, basically I'll just be serving wholesalers who are currently supplying oysters. And when I discover what attributes they're looking for, again, is it size? Is it maybe the color of the oysters that they're looking for? I'm going to take that data and create a survey that looks like this, that I'll be using with the restaurant owners. So what I do is I generate a series of hypothetical products using different attributes. So in this case, my attributes are whether they're fresh or frozen, whether they're foreign from the mainland or if they're locally grown, how consistent the supply is, and of course the price. So by surveying the restaurants, we begin to discover what attributes they're looking for and how they make these trade-offs between products. And our goal with this survey is to discover if people are actually willing to pay more for a locally grown oyster, because right now the cost inputs here are much higher than the mainland. So our oysters would have to achieve a price premium in order to be profitable here. And we're hoping we can capture a specialized market that's interested in oysters that are locally grown and available fresh. So I've been into the project for a year now, and I've actually finished the production side. So is this profitable? You guys are probably all wondering. The answer is it really depends. Right now, it's looking a little bit to the negative side. That's primarily because the rent cost for these fish ponds is insane. But this may be more catered to a more backyard farmer. So many people actually have rights to fish ponds that have been in their families for generations. If you're looking to lease your own fish pond, this probably isn't going to be the right venture for you. But if you are a resident of Molokai, where many fish ponds are still available and owned by the families that have held rights to them for generations, this could be very profitable for you. So what does this all mean for us? Are we just here to make money? Not necessarily. The expected outcomes also extend to a broader social scale. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these fish ponds are in disrepair. We're hoping that if we can find a way to get them actively used again to generate profit, that people will begin to start restoring them. And hopefully this will push the state to allocate more resources to this project as well. And we're also interested in getting people interested in growing oysters as well, and also getting people interested in traditional aquaculture here in Hawaii. So I just wanted to thank my co-authors, Dr. Maria Haas, who's our expert biologist and is studying the grow-out conditions here, Dr. Quentin Fong, who's our marketing specialist, and my advisor, Ping Sun Liam at UH Manoa, and of course, Sea Grant, who's generously funded this project. And with that, thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie Qay Chen. I'll be talking a little bit about acoustics of humpback whale mother-calf pairs. Okay, so first of all, I'll talk a little bit about why we're using acoustics. So first of all, think about it. If you're underwater, how far can you really see? Light doesn't travel very far underwater because it gets dispersed very quickly with all the particles that can be in the water. For example, if you look at this picture, you can kind of see the stuff close up is pretty colorful, but the further you get, the more blue it looks, and then the less you can see, right? So light doesn't travel very far. On the other hand, sound travels 4 times faster in water than it does in air. And then, so it travels further and stays louder for longer. And this map shows a picture of a experiment they did back in the early 90s where they played a sound very loud from this place called Heard Island down the South Indian Ocean area. They were able to pick up this sound pretty much around the world. You can see all the way up on the east coast of the US and the west coast. So as you can see, sound is a good way to transfer information underwater. We do know that humpback whales use sounds to communicate, as do a lot of other species in the water. Not only whales and dolphins, but fish as well. Invertebrates also use sound, like snapping shrimp. And then another thing that we're concerned about is noise pollution. There's been studies about how it affects humans in the air, for example, if you live near an airport. But now we're also concerned about sound in the oceans. Are we drowning out the whales? Can they still find each other? A lot of our current regulations are based on, for example, anatomical models, because we don't actually know what sounds the whales can hear. On the vocalization ranges that we've recorded them making, so we assume they can hear those same frequencies. And then extrapolating based on other species for which we do have data. And then there have been people out there doing behavioral response studies where they'll find a group of animals, they'll play a sound, and then they'll observe what their reaction is to that sound. But because this is a behavioral reaction, and whales are underwater for most of the time, it can be very difficult to really pin down what their reactions are. So if we can find a way to study their behaviors, their acoustic behaviors, and draw further observations from that, then it would be a very useful way to know how we're affecting them. Okay, so why am I focused on mother-calf communications? Well, humpback whales are still listed as endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. And so calves are very important because they're the ones that will grow the population. We know that humpback whale calves are exposed to a variety of sounds, both natural and anthropogenic or man-made. These can include sounds from, for example, for humpback whales, the males that sing during winter, the mothers that may be making sounds to communicate with them. It could include things like oil exploration and sonar out in the waters where humans are. And we have recorded the calves making sounds, so we know they produce sounds, but they're poorly characterized. We only have a few recordings, a general idea of what frequencies they might use, but no real idea of how loud they are or how often they make these sounds. And then because they're so poorly known, we haven't been able to really compare them to sounds made by adult whales. And we assume that the sounds produced by calves are important in their development because as adults, we know they use sounds a lot. For example, for the males, singing for reproduction, even though we don't know exactly what the context is. We know that in social groups, they make a lot of so-called social sounds to communicate with each other. For feeding, they use that to coordinate for feeding together in groups. And so once these calves grow up, we know they're going to be using these sounds for something. We just don't know how they developed or how they learned these sounds. So quick review, the humpback whales are pretty large. The calves are 10 to 15 feet and a ton at birth. and the females grow larger than males, up to about 50 feet or so, and are 25 to 40 tons. And just a note, the boat that we use to tag these whales from is actually 35 feet. So we're smaller than the females when we go looking for them. So the goal of the study was to answer basic questions about mother-calf vocalizations. What sounds are they making? For example, what frequencies are they using? How loud are they? What kinds of sounds? For example, they're frequency modulated, so they change in pitch, or there's amplitude modulated, where it's the same frequency, but they change how loud it is. And then there are other things like grunts and percussive sounds, such as when they breach or peck slap or tail slap. We believe those can be used for communications as well. And then additional part of the study is to look at boat engine noise in Hawaii and try and determine at what level will they disrupt the communications between mothers and calves. Okay, how we did this is we attached these non-invasive archival acoustic and movement tags, which this is one of them, an AccuSound. So you can see it's got suction cups at the bottom and attaches to the animal, and then it's got different accelerometers, a hydrophone, battery, and storage. All are in here in this top area. I'll show you the picture. So this is one of them, and then we have another one on the bottom. That's the B probe down there. They do the same thing. We stick them on the whale, and it will record them. And then once it comes off, we can look at the data. So if you'd like, I'll pass it around. Just please don't press on the brown area up here. And then we also recorded sounds from various vessels that were driving by using the same tags so that we could do a direct comparison of the sounds. And then using the recordings, we can calculate the amplitude, so that was the loudness, and frequency, which is the pitch of the sounds. All right, so this gives you an idea of what it's like to tag an animal. So I'm on the front of a boat, and I've got this 25-foot long pole with the tag at the end of it. And this is a successful tag of a mom. So that's one that went pretty well, and you saw the whale come up, and we were able to slap the tag right on her back. This next one is gives you an idea of how difficult it can be sometimes. So you might think this is a great opportunity. We had a friendly whale that swam up to the boat, was playing around, swimming under the boat around us, and just kind of hanging out. But I almost missed putting the tag on her. So, let's see. So what you see there is actually the bottom of the whale. She's upside down. So I don't know why the video's a lot slower than the sound right now. Oh. Yes, I did. Let's see. Oh. So she was going back down, and we didn't know if the tag would stay on for a while. but it went on and it stayed. But it gives you an idea. It can be very difficult when you can't. You can do your best to predict when the animal's coming up and when you'll be able to place a tag on them, but sometimes they'll just do something at the last moment, and it might not go on. You might miss, or it might go on like that one, and you're just not sure how long it'll stay because you couldn't see it go on very firmly. The other thing we used was this setup here where we had a buoy and a line going under it with our recorders underneath, and then we drove the boat by so we could record how loud the engine was. And we were taking measurements of the distance to the buoy. Since whales are protected, the whale watching boats are supposed to stay 100 yards away. And so we were doing passes at 100 yards, we were doing it closer at 50 yards, further away at 150, just to kind of get an idea of what it sounds like underwater to have a boat driving by a whale and what they might be hearing. So a little bit about the results. Calling rates of the tagged animals were pretty low. I was able to look at tags placed on 2 calves. One of them, we had a total of 28 possible calls. It's kind of hard to be sure whether the calls are coming from that animal or not, because one, we have a lot of flow noise and that can obscure some of the sounds that are recorded on there. And I also saw a lot of these strange sounds that were really low frequency, so I wasn't sure if they were actually calls from an animal or not, because we've never recorded sounds like that from humpback whales. So that's kind of a mystery that I'm still trying to solve. But so you can see the first calf where we got 28 possible calls, 4 that are definite calls. It was on that animal for almost 2 hours. The second animal, it was on that animal for about 6 hours, and we got 90 calls, but most of those 90 calls were in 1 hour where it was doing a lot of surface activity. So I could hear things like breaches, tail slaps, and we have it in our behavioral record where the calf was out there doing breaches, tail slaps, peck slaps, rolling around on the mom, and I was able to hear that on the tag, which is really interesting. But that was about 1 hour of the tag time. The rest of the 5 hours, there was almost nothing. So that was very interesting. And then for the 2 mom tags that I've been able to look at, one of them, the tag was on for about 3.5 hours. All I got was 1 call. She was mostly traveling. There was not a lot of flow noise either, so they were traveling fairly slowly if they were, or they were stationary. The other one, I've gotten through about 3 hours of 4 and picked up about 68 calls. And again, those were in a time period where I was picking up a lot of surface activity. There were a lot of sounds that sounded like impacts, so it could have been like, because it wasn't as loud, I don't think it was from the mother. I think it was from the calf that was in the group, and the calf was probably out there breaching, tail slapping, being active. And I find that very interesting because it coincided. It's not the same animal, but it's the same kind of behavior as the calf, where during the time that they're active, we're hearing calls. The calls resemble previously recorded social calls or song units, so they're pretty short. We get a lot of frequency modulated sounds, so that's change in frequency. But I did, as I said, find some calls that were in unexpectedly low frequencies, and those I'm not quite sure about yet. Just to give you an idea, here are a few calls where it says 55, 56, or 65, 66, 67. Those are some calls that I picked up from the tagged mother in a mother-calf group. And then all this red at the bottom, I should give you an idea. Up high on the y-axis, this is frequency. So up high is high frequency, at the bottom is low frequency. And then this is over time. The more red or yellow it is, the louder a sound is. And then black is quiet. So there are 3 calls, actually 4 calls in here, and then this bottom red layer you can see along the bottom is just flow noise. And this is an extreme version of flow noise. So as you can see, if the whales swing fast, we're not going to be able to hear anything on the recordings. So those are just some of the challenges we have working with tag data. A little bit of information, other information that we can get from the tags. We can get dive profile because there's a depth or pressure sensor on that tag. We found that the calves dove to a maximum of 85 meters, the mothers to a maximum of 100 meters, and the water depth in the area went to about 100 meters. So the moms went close to the bottom, the calves didn't quite get there, and the calves spent a lot more time at the surface. So we're going to try and match up the depth that they're at with the call activity and see if there's a correlation there. So future work, got to try and figure out a way to filter out some of that low frequency flow noise that you saw at the bottom of the spectrogram. And then I haven't had a chance to really quantify the boat engine sounds, but I will say that anecdotally, just looking at the data, listening, I've heard that the boat, when we drive up to pick up a tag, is very quiet. I barely pick it up. So if you have a smaller boat with a smaller engine that's pointed at a whale, they may not even hear it. But of course, this requires more in-depth look, and then hopefully we'll be able to quantify the engine sounds and compare that to what we're actually getting of the humpback whale calls. So I have a lot of people to thank, all my volunteers, Sea Grant, of course, for their funding. The Hawaiian Islands Humpback Whale National Marine Sanctuary folks were really helpful. They took us out on their boat, worked with us. And that's it. So I believe we're taking questions for everybody now.
Do they direct their sound like we do talking? I talk to you like fake you, my sound, but I talk to you in that direction, you don't hear. Is that true of animals?
A lot of animals do. So we know from experiments with captive dolphins that they have very directional beams, especially for echolocation. For humpback whales, we think there is some measure of directivity, but it's not as much as with dolphins. And it's generally kind of forward and a little bit down.
It's not directed at the other animal.
When they're calling, it could be, but it may depend on what sounds they're making. So like singers sing with their head down, and we think that may be some way to get their sound to go out in more a broader direction. Whereas for like mothers and calves, they may want to be quieter and direct it more towards each other and be quieter so that they aren't heard by other animals.
About the oysters, I noticed at the beginning there was a notation about not eating oriented oysters.
Oh.
Is that from North Korea, South Korea, or the whole Korean?
I believe those were specifically South Korea, and I think that news clip came out in 2014. So it was fairly recent. I wouldn't personally tell you not to eat oysters from Korea, but that's one of the implications of having imports, particularly from abroad. Is the chain of custody is kind of iffy. You're never really sure what the practices are. So that would be one of the benefits of having locally grown, because it's very strictly regulated in terms of sanitation.
And with the oysters are raising at Aloha Ranch, are they just using them at their restaurants, or are they selling them?
Right now, they're only available directly at their visitor center or the restaurants that they serve.
For the whales, if they were out there in Hanauma, they can occur in this one of us without anything special on or underlying here.
It's quite possible. Song during the winter time, the males that sing, they are very loud, and so I've heard that if you just swim out a little further, stick your head underwater, you'll be able to hear them even if they're not quite in the bay.
What makes the tail go off after 3 hours or 6 hours? Is it suction and it just falls off?
Yeah, so if you got a chance to look at the tag, it's just the suction cup. So after a while, they're moving enough that it just slips off and then it floats to the surface. It's got a radio antenna on it, and we find it using that if we've lost the group, which we have before.
How long does it take the oyster to mature to get comfortable?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the species they're farming here is the Pacific oyster. On the mainland, it generally takes about 2 years. Here, they're going out in 6 to 7 months.
Cool.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Sure. So I was wondering, how did you get your results for if the fish are self-recruiting or traveling or being lost? Like,
So in the model, we always know where we release them or where they're spawned. And then we keep track of them as they move around in the water, in the model. And then we know where they successfully settle. So if it's the same island, we call that self-recruitment. And if they settle on a different island, that would be just settlement in total. So we know their location at every day in the model for as long as we run it.
and then is the model based on like genetic studies or anything?
No, this model is, I compare it with genetic studies, but the model itself is just a model of the ocean currents, so how the oceans move around the islands. I use those, and then I sort of just drop virtual larvae in there and see how they get around.